My family took a $3,000 vacation without me, then assumed I'd watch their kids for free. I left at 5 a.m., and they called CPS when they found out. I'm Riley, 22 years old, and I recently graduated from college with a finance degree. For as long as I can remember, I've wanted to graduate from high school, attend a decent college, find a nice job, and move out. It seems simple enough, right? However, life had other plans. I graduated, obtained my degree, and then returned to my parents' home in a little Ohio town. Do not get me wrong, I adore my parents, Denise and Russell. They are wonderful people who have worked hard to establish a stable environment for me and my sister Morgan. But going home wasn't exactly the dream I'd been chasing for 4 years. The plan was to stay with them for a few months while I sought work and saved up enough money to buy my own home. It seemed reasonable. No rent, free food, and a chance to regroup while I plotted my next steps. I told myself that it was a sensible option even though it stung my pride a little. Initially, everything went well. Within a week, I was employed as an analyst at Western Group, a mid-sized corporation that specializes in financial planning for small businesses. The pay was not high, but it was consistent and the benefits were decent. That evening, I came home feeling as if I had taken my first important step toward independence. Mom was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and Dad was watching television in the living room. I grabbed a plate of food, sat down at the table, and presented the news. I got the job, I said, delighted. I start Monday. For a moment, I thought they'd be excited. I was anticipating some congratulations, maybe even a, "we're proud of you." Instead, they exchanged that look that parents give when they're about to say something terrible. Mom lowered her fork and smiled tightly. "That's great, Riley, really. We knew you'd find something quickly." But Dad chimed in. "We've been meaning to talk to you about something." My stomach dropped. This wasn't going to be good. Mom sighed and folded her hands on the table. "With my arthritis getting worse, I've had to cut back my hours at the library. And your dad's hours at the auto shop have been reduced. They're talking about more layoffs too." I inquired, knowing exactly where this was going. "And we could use some help with the bills," Mom said, apologizing. "Just until things stabilize. You wouldn't have to pay rent or anything, it's just the utilities and groceries have been harder to manage." I sat there staring at my plate. When I returned, I decided to contribute here and there to support my own expenses. But that was more than I expected. Nonetheless, they were my parents. They had always been supportive and they were not asking for much. "Yeah, of course," I said, pretending to smile. "It's the least I can do." Looking back, that was the moment when I should have set boundaries. But guilt is a strong emotion. Over the next 6 months, things settled into a pattern. I'd wake up, go to work, come home, and crash. Every month I sent my parents a sizable amount of my wages to pay bills, groceries, and other costs. On top of that, I took on minor tasks they claimed they didn't have time for, like running errands for Mom when her arthritis flared up or correcting Dad's Excel sheets because he wasn't a computer person. It was not just about money. I had not anticipated having to provide time, energy, or patience. At first, I convinced myself that it was only temporary, a tiny gesture to my parents, who had always been there for me. However, as time went, I started to notice minor nuances. If I mentioned wanting to save for my own place, Mom would sigh deeply and say, "It must be nice to think about moving out when the rest of us are struggling to get by." Dad was no different. He'd shake his head and say, "Some people have no idea how hard it is to make ends meet." Whenever I spent money on myself, such as when I bought new work clothes, it wasn't just the guilty feeling, it was a total lack of appreciation for everything I had given up. My friends stopped inviting me out because I couldn't afford to attend. My desire to see the metropolis faded with each month as my savings account refused to grow. When I told Mom that I was considering having a second job to help save money faster, her only response was, "Well, just don't let it interfere with what we need." That stung. What we need. I was giving everything I had to keep this household together, but it wasn't enough. But I didn't believe it was very malicious. They weren't nasty or demanding. But the guilt trips were subtle and constant, like pouring water over a rock. Meanwhile, I began to feel stuck. I had planned to stay for 3 to 6 months at most, but the more I assisted them, the more they appeared to rely on me. The bills continued coming in, and I kept paying them, all while my ideal of freedom receded further away. Still, I told myself it was only temporary. I just needed to save a little more, and I'd be done. I even started looking at city apartments, thinking what it would be like to have my own place. However, before I could take the next step, life threw me another curveball. It was a Friday evening in late spring. I'd just gotten home from work and was looking forward to a peaceful night of Netflix and leftovers. Mom was in the kitchen, and Dad was outside tinkering with the mower. Everything seemed normal until the doorbell rang. I answered the door to see my older sister Morgan standing there looking agitated. Travis, her husband, was behind her holding a bag. Their two children, Ava, 5, and Milo, 3, ran around the yard like sugar-fueled tornadoes. "Surprise," Morgan said, flashing a large fake smile. I stood there for a second, unsure what to say. Travis, behind her, looked tired as he carried suitcases and a duffel bag. "What's going on?" I eventually asked, stepping aside as Morgan marched past me like she owned the place. "We need a place to stay for a little while," she said, already walking toward the living room. She plopped down on the couch and groaned deeply. "Travis's consultant role has ended, and my boutique's sales have decreased, making it tough to pay the rent. You understand how things are, except that I didn't. I had no idea you allowed things to become so bad that you packed up your entire family and showed up unannounced in someone else's home." Travis ultimately passed through the door with his arms full. "Hey, Riley," he said softly, barely making eye contact before moving the stuff upstairs. I was still standing there, unmoving, when Mom entered from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Oh, my babies are here," she exclaimed, clutching Morgan in a hug. "You poor things. You've been through so much. Don't you worry, we'll take care of everything." Dad entered a minute later, holding Milo in one arm like a football. "This one nearly gave me a heart attack," he explained as he sat down, running straight for the mower like it's a ride at an amusement park. Morgan chuckled faintly, but I noticed she didn't apologize or even look at Milo to tell him to stop. I stood there, watching the scene develop as if I were in a different universe. Within minutes, my parents were praising Morgan like she was a military hero who had survived a major fight. Mom was already talking about supper and where they could place the kids' beds, and Dad offered to move his tools out of the spare room to create more space. Meanwhile, I stayed invisible. That night I sat in my room, trying to focus on a budget spreadsheet for work, but all I could hear was chaos downstairs. Ava and Milo ran up and down the corridor, yelling at the top of their lungs. Morgan's voice boomed around the living room as she told Mom about her recent business issues. I took a deep breath and reminded myself that it would only be a few weeks. That should be manageable for me. The next morning it was clear Morgan and Travis were not leaving anytime soon. They unloaded all of the bags, filled the spare room closet, and even took over a cabinet shelf for the children's food. And without saying anything overtly, I was picked as the babysitter. It started little. Morgan would casually ask me to keep an eye on Ava and Milo while she and Travis ran to the store. "It'll just be an hour," she'd say, grabbing for her purse. However, that hour generally lasted 2 or 3. Weekends were the worst. On Saturday mornings, I'd wake up hoping to rest and catch up on some reading or Netflix, only to find Morgan and Travis dressed to go out. Morgan would announce, "We're meeting friends for brunch," and hand me a list of kid-friendly activities she'd printed from the internet. We shouldn't be too long. By not too long, she meant the most of the day. Morgan acted as if I had just suggested dumping the kids in a ditch when I tried to push back the first time. "Riley, it's just brunch. You don't even have plans. What's the big deal?" "I was planning to spend the day catching up on work," I said, pointing to my laptop. Morgan rolled her eyes. "You're just sitting there on your computer anyway. Can't you do that with Ava and Milo in the room? You're being so dramatic." The worst moment was when Mom jumped in. "Riley, honey," she said, lowering her voice as if to convey some old wisdom. "Morgan works so hard, and she deserves a little break now and then." "I work hard too," I said, but Mom just waved me off. "Of course you do. But you're single, sweetie. You don't understand how much pressure comes with having a family to take care of." It was as if my own problems were irrelevant because I didn't have a husband or children to worry about. No matter what I said, it was always about how much tougher everyone else had it. Setting boundaries would be selfish of me. If I begged for some space, I was making it all about myself. And when Morgan and Travis returned from their never-ending brunches or errands, they'd behave like they'd just run a marathon. "You don't know what it's like out there," Travis once said, sagging into the couch as if he'd spent the day digging trenches instead of sipping mimosas. I wanted to shout, "I don't know what it's like?" I had just spent 6 hours stopping Milo from eating Play-Doh while Ava asked for a snack every 5 minutes. Of course, bringing it up would be overly whining. I spent my Saturdays watching Bluey and trying to keep Milo from throwing blocks at me, while Ava demanded snacks every 5 minutes. Mom and Dad conveniently left during these extended babysitting sessions, claiming they needed to do errands or complete garage tasks. When I told Morgan later, she rolled her eyes. "Riley, they're just kids. It's not that hard. Not too difficult." It was simple for her to say when she wasn't scrubbing crayon smears off the walls or explaining why eating Play-Doh is a bad idea. The worst part was that few people seemed to appreciate what I was doing. Morgan acted as if I was being dramatic anytime I mentioned it. Travis rarely spoke to me unless he needed something. And Mom and Dad seemed to think everything was just normal. "You're such a big help," Mom said one evening after I mentioned how fatigued I was. "It's good practice for when you have kids someday." The constant guilt trips were starting to wear me down. Every time I pondered saying no or setting stronger limits, I remembered Mom's words. Family helps family. So, what about me? Didn't I deserve to live my own life? It wasn't just babysitting either. My salary, which had previously been enough to support the costs of 3 people, was now stretched thin with 5 more mouths to feed. The cost of groceries and utilities doubled overnight. I attempted to bring it up one evening after dinner. "Hey Morgan, would you and Travis be able to chip in for groceries this week?" She looked at me as if I had asked her to donate her kidney. "We're barely scraping by as it is, Riley, you know that." Travis nodded attentively. "It's tough out there right now." I bit my tongue and let it go, but inside I was enraged. As the weeks turned into months, I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home. My bedroom became the only place I could hide, but even that wasn't safe. Ava and Milo had fun breaking in unexpectedly and dumping toys and crumbs everywhere. Everyone but me realized this was not a temporary scenario. Morgan and Travis were becoming overly comfortable, and I was paying the price both financially and emotionally. I should have spoken up earlier, but every time I did, I felt like the bad guy. I was repeatedly told that I was overreacting or being selfish, so I remained silent. Then one evening, I overheard a conversation that changed everything. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but living in a house with individuals who don't grasp the notion of an indoor voice makes it impossible not to overhear conversations. I was sitting in my room one evening, scrolling through job postings to distract myself from the chaos downstairs, when I heard the end of Mom's phone call. "Yes, we're all going to Florida next weekend for Celesta's retirement celebration. It'll be so nice to have the whole family together for a proper send-off," she said with a grin. I froze. Florida, retirement celebrations, whole family. I stood up and moved into the hallway, craning my neck to see whether I had misheard. Mom was still on the phone and pacing in the kitchen, her back to me. "Of course Riley will be here to watch the kids, it just makes sense. No point in dragging them along to something they wouldn't enjoy." Ah, there it was. Except for myself, the whole family would go to Florida. Apparently I had already offered to stay behind and babysit. I went back to my room thinking, how could they just forget me? The more I thought about it, the angrier I grew. Not only was I not informed about the trip, but they did not even contemplate including me. I was not invited, was not asked if I could babysit, and was not given any previous notice. They just assumed. Because it is what my family did. The ensuing days were filled with frustration and awkward silence. Morgan was busy shopping for vacation clothes, flaunting her new swimsuit and flip-flops around the house, while Ava and Milo were making havoc in the living room. Travis spoke constantly about how much he was looking forward to relaxing on the beach. Mom, meantime, was in full planning mode, making vacation arrangements and double-checking her packing list. Dad, of course, agreed with everything she said, nodding when necessary but adding little more than an occasional grunt of agreement. Nobody addressed the fact that I was not going. I tried to bring it up gently during dinner one night. "So when were you all planning to tell me about Florida?" I asked, stabbing at my salad. Mom glanced at me with amazement. "Oh, I thought Morgan told you." Morgan didn't even look up from her plate. "I assumed you knew. Mom's been talking about it for weeks." For weeks. I wanted to shout. Weeks passed, and no one thought to speak to me. "So what's the plan?" I asked, attempting to appear calm. "You all head to Florida and I just stay here with the kids?" "Well, yes," Mom responded matter-of-factly. "It just makes the most sense. The kids wouldn't enjoy a retirement party, and someone needs to stay behind to look after them. You're so good with Ava and Milo, and it's not like you'd want to come anyway." That last part stung. "Why wouldn't I want to come?" I asked, trying to maintain a calm tone. Morgan gradually looked up, her expression somewhere between pity and irritation. "It's a family trip, Riley. Adults only. You wouldn't even know anyone there besides Aunt Celeste. And it's not like you're close to her." Dad chimed in, trying to calm things down. "We just figured this was the best arrangement for everyone. You'll have the house to yourself for a few days. Peace and quiet." Was he serious? How relaxing would it be to follow two hyperactive kids all weekend while the rest of the family sipped margaritas on the beach? After that, I ended the conversation. It was clear that they had already made up their minds, and nothing I said would change that. As the days passed, I began to feel like an outsider in my own family. The enthusiasm in the house was palpable. Morgan and Mom were continuously talking about clothes, plans, and which restaurants they would visit in Florida. Travis, who rarely displayed emotion beyond mild rage, appears to be really excited about the trip. Meanwhile, I stayed invisible. However, the pattern was not exclusive to the Florida vacation. Morgan was always the center of attention when we were kids. She was the cheerleading captain, and her accomplishments were recognized with balloons and banners. I was the nerdy one. But it didn't matter because Morgan's trophies adorned the shelves and her face was prominently displayed in every family photo. Years later, nothing has changed. Morgan was still the golden child, and I was still the afterthought, the person they called when they needed something, the one they relied on but never fully appreciated. I tried to distract myself by focusing on work, but it was hard to concentrate with Ava and Milo constantly barging into my room or shrieking at each other about toys. Morgan's parenting method appears to involve handing the kids an iPad and letting them run wild. Travis wasn't doing much better. He'd sit on the couch and check his phone as chaos erupted around him. But things started to shift one afternoon when I overheard Morgan talking to Mom in the kitchen. "It's just so nice to have Riley around," she shared with me. "I don't know what we'd do without her taking care of the kids. She's like the glue holding everything together." This is exactly what I did to them. Not a person with my own life and goals, but rather the glue that holds theirs together. That's when I understood I couldn't keep doing this. I couldn't continue to sacrifice my happiness and freedom for a family that took me for granted. I spent the rest of the week preparing my escape. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life. If they could arrange a trip without informing me, I could plan my own. I attempted to think of where I'd go. Then I remembered that one of my undergrad friends, Brooke, had mentioned going camping that weekend. She and a few others were heading to Blue Ridge Falls, and she had invited me to accompany them. I denied her request since I figured I'd be stuck at home babysitting. But suddenly it felt like a terrific opportunity. I texted Brooke that night. "Is there still room on the trip this weekend?" Her reply arrived almost instantly. "Of course. We're leaving early Saturday morning. You in?" I looked at my phone for a moment before responding. "I'm in." The decision seemed liberating. I was finally putting myself first, and this was no ordinary camping trip. It was a lifeline, a chance to get out of the house and away from the chaos that has consumed my life. However, it would be tough to carry out. My family had a knack for sniffing out anything that didn't revolve around them, and if they discovered I was planning something for me, it was over before it even began. I had to be wise about this. The days leading up to Saturday were tense. Morgan was in full holiday mode, parading about the house with new beach hats and a playlist she insisted on blasting at high level. Travis spent the majority of his time tinkering with the children's car seats and complaining about how much luggage they needed to put into the trunk. Meanwhile, Mom rushed around with a clipboard, double-checking the packing list. "Riley, don't forget Ava likes her milk warmed before bed," she said, as if I hadn't heard it 3 times before. "Oh, and Milo's picky about his pajamas. Make sure he's in the blue ones." I nodded, biting my tongue to prevent saying something I could regret. There was no point in disputing. I had already volunteered to be the weekend babysitter, and nothing I said would change their minds. By Friday night, the house looked like a zoo. Mom and Morgan were deciding which foods to bring. Travis was attempting to mend a squeaky luggage wheel as the children ran around the living room like miniature hurricanes. Dad, as usual, had gone to the garage to check on the tools, which I assumed was code for fleeing the commotion. I watched it all from the kitchen, silently drinking my tea and counting down the hours till morning. Around 10 p.m., everything started to calm down. Mom put the kids to bed, Morgan went upstairs to pack her last few needs, and Travis laid down on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I waited until the house was completely silent before entering my room and grabbed my duffel bag. I'd been packing slowly all week to avoid suspicion, putting my hiking boots and clothes at the back of my wardrobe. I carefully packed my toothbrush, flashlight, and a few snacks before sealing it. My heart was racing with anticipation rather than dread. This was not just about camping. It was about restoring control of my life. My alarm rang at 5 a.m., sharp. I got out of bed, grabbed my duffel bag, and tiptoed to the door. The house was extraordinarily quiet, the type of quietness that only occurs in the early hours of the morning. I held my breath as I opened the front door, cringing as it creaked more than expected. I froze for a second, waiting for someone to call after me, but nothing occurred. The air outside was cool and refreshing. I took one last look at the darkened house before getting into my car and started it. As I backed out of the driveway, I felt a sense of relaxation. I was free. The journey to Blue Ridge Falls was both peaceful and pleasant. The farther I traveled from home, the lighter I felt. I turned on the radio and relaxed for the first time in what seemed like months. Although I kept thinking how my family would react when they got up, I tried to distract myself and focus exclusively on myself. Brooke had texted me the camping location, and when I arrived, the sun had fully risen. She was already there, unloading her car and setting up her tent. "Hey, you made it!" she exclaimed, waving as I parked beside her. "Of course," I responded. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." The campsite was just secluded enough to feel like a real escape, but not so far away that we couldn't find a good route or two. Brooke introduced me to the remainder of the group, which included her college classmates and coworkers. Everyone seemed comfortable and nice, with few questions. We spent the morning erecting tents, gathering firewood, and determining which paths to explore. By midday, we were deep in the woods. It was unusual to be surrounded by nature instead of screaming children and constant requests. Brooke and I settled into a relaxed rhythm, discussing work, life, and everything in between. She didn't inquire about my family, and I didn't respond. This excursion wasn't about them. It was about me. That evening, we gathered around the campfire to eat marshmallows and tell stories. "This is exactly what I needed," I said, relaxing on my camp chair and enjoying the warmth of the fire. "Same," Brooke replied, adding another log to the fire. "We should do this more often. Just get away from everything, you know." I nodded and stared at the flames. For the first time in a long time, I felt completely calm. Nobody begged me for favors. Nobody was guilt-tripping me. No one asked me to sacrifice my time and energy for their benefit. As the night went, I found myself laughing harder than I had in ages. It wasn't just the jokes or anecdotes. It was the feeling of being surrounded by people who didn't demand anything from me. During this time, I did not check my phone once. When we returned to the campsite that evening from our journey, I was fatigued in the greatest way possible. My legs hurt, my face was sunburned, and my heart felt lighter than it has in months. I was no longer concerned about my family's expectations or regular demands. I was contemplating what I wanted, where I was going, and how I would get there. That is, until I opened the front door. The house was a mess. Toy dinosaurs, crayons, and what looked to be an empty cereal bag were all sprawled out across the couch. The faint smell of something burning lingered in the air, and I could hear voices coming from the living room. "Riley's here," Mom replied, her voice not as warm as usual. It seemed sharp, like if she were about to unleash something on me. I left my duffel bag at the door and entered the living room. Mom, Morgan, Travis, and Dad were sitting together, their faces flushed with wrath. Ava was screaming aloud, and Milo was curled up on the floor, holding a juice box. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. "What's going on?" Morgan said, standing up and pointing at me. "You disappeared without telling anyone. That's what's going on." "I told you I wasn't babysitting this weekend," I replied, crossing my arms. "You didn't tell us where you were going or what the hell you were doing," Mom screamed, flushing. "I'm an adult, I don't need to check in," I said, my patience fraying. "Well, when we realized you weren't here with the kids, we panicked," Travis had told us. Panic was not even close to describing it. They said they were shocked when they discovered I wasn't at home on Saturday morning. My car was gone, my room was empty, and I had left no notes. Instead of assuming I had gone somewhere or taken a much-needed break, they immediately went to the worst-case scenario. "We thought something had happened to you," Mom said, her voice quivering. "We even called CPS." That stopped me in my tracks. "You called CPS? For what?" "For abandoning the kids," Morgan cried, as if it were the most obvious thing on the planet. "First of all," I replied, waving my hand to interrupt her, "I never agreed to watch your kids this weekend. You all decided that on your own, without consulting me. Second, calling CPS on me for not being here is insane. What exactly did you tell them?" "Hi, we wanted to abandon our own kids with someone who didn't agree to it, but now she's not home, so please arrest her." "Did they laugh before or after they hung up on you?" "That's insane." "It wasn't insane when we didn't know where you were," Mom exclaimed. "I couldn't take their foolishness anymore." "So what happened when CPS showed up?" "They left after we explained everything," Morgan said softly. "But do you have any idea how embarrassing that was?" "Embarrassing?" I questioned, my voice rising. "You called CPS because I didn't stick around to babysit your kids and you're worried about embarrassment?" The argument escalated from there. Morgan accused me of being selfish and irresponsible. Travis mentioned something about how I had let everyone down. Mom continued mentioning how I had abandoned my family. Dad, of course, sat there shaking his head in disappointment, as he frequently did when things did not go as planned. By the time the yelling ended, I was too tired to fight. I took my duffel bag and went upstairs to my room, closing the door behind me. The chaos remained until Monday. I left for work early, not wanting to deal with any more guilt trips or accusations. However, my phone was already inundated with texts. "Mom, we need to talk about your behavior this weekend." Morgan, "Riley, you totally screwed us over." Travis, "You owe the family an apology." I disregarded them all. At work, I tried to focus, but the stress of the weekend hovered over me. My co-workers could tell something was wrong, but I wasn't about to unload my family drama in the midst of the break room. By the time I got home that evening, I was ready for round 2. Mom was waiting for me in the kitchen from the time I entered. "We need to talk," she said, folding her arms. "I'm tired," I told her, attempting to walk by. "Riley," she said firmly, pushing in front of me. "This can't wait." I grimaced and set my luggage down. "What now?" Mom's face softened, but her voice remained severe. "Your sister is hurt. She feels like you abandoned her when she needed you most." I looked at her, bewildered. She needed me for what? To babysit her kids while she went on vacation? That's not my responsibility, Mom. "You should do your part as a member of this family," she said, her voice full of anguish. "Funny how that only applies to me," I commented. "When has Morgan ever helped me? When has anyone helped me?" Mom opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. "Exactly," I replied, gathering my suitcase and heading upstairs. The next few days were tense. Morgan hardly spoke to me, and when she did, she only made passive-aggressive comments about how difficult it is to find good babysitters these days. Travis stayed out of it, which was probably a good thing. But his silence was nearly as unpleasant as the arguing. Mom and Dad tried to act as if nothing had happened, but each conversation was loaded with regret. "We're a family," Mom would say at random, as if that was enough to solve everything. I realized I couldn't remain much longer. The house felt more oppressive than ever, and no amount of space or time could improve the situation. One evening, when I was folding laundry, Dad knocked on my door. "Can we talk?" he asked, his tone quieter than usual. "Sure," I said, even though I was not in the mood for another lecture. He stepped in and sat on the edge of my bed, staring down at his hands. "Look, I know things have been tough lately, and I know you feel like we've been unfair to you." I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "But your mom and I are just trying to keep everyone together," I was told. "This family's been through a lot, and we're all trying to do our best." "Dad, I understand," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "But I can't keep sacrificing my life for everyone else. I'm 22. I should be building my future, not cleaning up after Morgan and Travis." He nodded slowly, but I could tell he didn't quite understand. "We'll figure this out," he said after a long pause. "Just give it some time." I nodded, but I knew deep down that time would not make this better. By the end of the week, I had made a decision. It was time to leave. The house no longer felt like a home, but more like a war. I knew if I stayed too long, I'd lose what little sanity I had left. I began searching for apartments. After months of paying bills that weren't mine, my savings were small, but they were enough to get me started. I found a handful of listings that looked promising. Nothing extraordinary, just clean and tiny. I looked at my phone for a moment before phoning Aunt Celeste. She picked up on the second ring. "Riley, how are you, sweetheart?" she inquired, her tone warm and sympathetic. "Hey, Aunt Celeste. I'm okay, I guess," I responded, unsure how to start this conversation. She recognized my hesitant tone right away. "What's going on? Is everything all right?" "Not really," I admitted. "I don't know if you heard, but I didn't go to your retirement trip." "I noticed," she said. "Your mom said you were staying behind to help with the kids. I thought that sounded odd. Why didn't you come?" I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Because no one told me about it. They just assumed I'd babysit like always." Aunt Celeste remained silent for a moment before drawing a rapid breath. "That doesn't surprise me, unfortunately. Your mom mentioned how much you've been helping out, but it sounds like they've been taking advantage of you." "Yeah, you could say that," I answered. "I'm actually thinking about moving out, but I'm not sure how to handle the fallout." "Well, sweetheart, you've done more than enough. You're young. You shouldn't be tied down like this. Move out, set boundaries, and let them figure out their own mess. It's not your responsibility to fix everything for them." Hearing those words felt like a weight was lifted off my chest. She added forcefully, "And if you need help, let me know. You deserve better than this." That conversation gave me the motivation I needed. The following morning, I informed the landlord that I would no longer be paying rent starting next month and that my parents would have to take over. I hesitated to take this step, but I knew it was necessary. After that, I spent the day packing. I didn't bother alerting anyone, and there was no use in starting another dispute until I was ready to depart. I packed all I could put into my car, and the rest could wait. That evening, I arrived downstairs for dinner, ready to drop the bomb. The tension was already high. Morgan had rarely spoken to me this week, and Mom had loomed like a dark cloud. "Can we talk?" I asked, putting down my fork. Mom looked up, wary. "What is it, Riley?" I stated plainly, "I am moving out." The silence was horrible. Morgan's fork clattered on her plate, and Mom's jaw dropped. Even Dad was surprised, but he quickly hid it with his usual grin. "You're what?" Mom asked, her voice shaking. "I'm moving out," I repeated again. "I've already found a place, and I'll be leaving by the end of the weekend." "But you can't just leave," Mom said, her voice rising. "We need you here, the bills. The kids? It is not my responsibility, I explained. I've been paying for this house, babysitting Morgan's kids, and putting my life on hold for months. It's time for me to live my own life. Morgan scoffed. Wow. So you're just going to abandon us? How selfish can you be? I turned to her, my patience worn out. Selfish? Morgan, you've been living here rent-free, dumping your kids on me every chance you get, and contributing absolutely nothing. If anyone's selfish, it's you. That's enough, Riley, Dad said sternly. No, it's not enough, I replied. I've done everything you've asked and more, and all I've gotten in return is guilt trips and disrespect. I'm done. Mom's face crumpled, but I did not let it bother me. I've already told the landlord I won't be contributing to the rent anymore, I said. So you'll need to figure that out too. Morgan appeared to be about to erupt. Are you kidding me? You're just going to leave us with all the bills? How are we supposed to manage without you? Not my problem, I said, echoing her own words from months before. The next morning I packed the rest of my belongings into my car. Mom stood on the porch looking sad but saying nothing. Dad stayed inside, avoiding the entire scene. Morgan did not even bother to come downstairs. As I pulled out of the driveway, I had a variety of emotions, but overall, I felt liberated. The first few days in my new flat felt surreal. Mom called several times, but I did not respond. I wasn't prepared to deal with her yet. Morgan wrote me several angry SMS accusing me of abandoning the family, so I disabled her phone number. Aunt Celeste called to check in. I'm proud of you, sweetheart, she said. It's not easy to stand up for yourself, especially with family, but you did the right thing. Thanks, Aunt Celeste, I said, smiling. I think so too. It's been a few months, and things are starting to feel normal. I've reunited with old friends, started new interests, and even begun saving for a trip to Europe next year. I have kept a distance from my relatives. Mom still sends me the occasional guilt-inducing text, but I've stopped letting it bother me. Morgan and I have not communicated since I left, and I am fine with that. I understand they need to change, but it is no longer my responsibility. And I've spent enough of my life putting them first. It is time to prioritize myself for a change. And you know what? I don't regret it.